We're back for the second half of Jesse Cox's long but incredibly well-produced video between 15 years of WoW and 1 year of 14. The first half was heavily focused on content and introducing the two games. Now we'll be going into gameplay, visuals, music, and community.
The most notable difference in gameplay between the two, I think, is to start, the global cooldown in Final Fantasy XIV is 2.5 seconds. So when you're level 10, for example, and you only have 3 abilities, it seems like there's a lot of downtime. Later on, as you unlock other off-cooldown skills or increase your stats to lower your GCD, this changes, but for the start, it definitely feels pretty slow. This also translates into differences between the spell and ability rotations of the two games. Warcraft is more reactionary. Build up a bar or wait for a crit to trigger an ability, while Final Fantasy XIV is more proactive, where the player weaves a pattern of combos together to create a string of pre-planned attacks. Even the procs in Final Fantasy XIV are associated with patterns and planning. Combat in WoW is like a street brawl, and Final Fantasy XIV is like a dance. And because 14 is more of a dance, the combat is more spectacular, and the spell effects are way more flashy than those in WoW. And for the most part, spell effects aren't necessarily designed with large groups in mind, unlike Warcraft. So when you're in a 24-man raid and all the effects are going off, it can sometimes feel blinding. So much so that there are options in 14 to decrease or turn them off for other players. Speaking of making changes to the game, 14 has a pretty amazing HUD custom.
The rotation is very straightforward in 14. It's going to vary by class. Some classes feel very, very just repetitive. Others feel like there's a bit of like skill priority going on. That's something that they've leaned into harder over the years. We've seen them prune abilities. We've seen them, they continue to add new abilities with every expansion. We're going to get more with Endwalker. There's pros and cons to this. I will say the classes within their role feel less different to me. The tanks feel less different than the way tanks work in WoW. So as a result, because you can't be as reactionary as he put it, there's not as much utility. 14 doesn't really do a lot of CC. I know that people playing TBC Classic right now might be being shown CC to a level they haven't seen it if they've never played it before. It's just different. The group sizes and the way the content is designed has a huge impact on class design and the other way around. When people come over, there is a rough translation, right? So a black mage's undulation between fire and ice can feel a little bit like Boomkin back when they've had these kind of solar and lunar pendulums swinging back and forth. When you have jobs that are more in your face, or jobs that are more careful and cautious, jobs that provide huge amounts of group utility as opposed to jobs whose primary focus is DPS and they really don't offer much else. The way comps are set up, the way all of this stuff's set up, you could make an entire video about everything he just talked about there, because comparing WoW across all of their classes, and within those classes all of their specializations, which allows those classes to funnel into things where they can have multiple ways to play, versus Final Fantasy XIV, where every job is that one thing. Every paladin is a tank. Every black mage is DPS. There's not any flexibility there. And so the total number of jobs in the game is 17 plus blue mage, soon to be 20 minus blue mage. So 19, and it just lends itself to a very different texture when you talk about somebody who's combat driven and they say, what should I play?
Customization in the base game. While you can do a lot more with the various add-ons in WoW, 14 gives you enough tools to customize your experience so that you don't feel the absence of add-on support. This UI customization allows for the use of a controller, which the game was designed with in mind, allowing for cross-platform play between PC and PlayStation.
So Shadowlands did add native controller support to World of Warcraft. That's for the first time. Prior to that, it would have been add-ons. And absolutely I agree with him that in complexity, you have native WoW, then Final Fantasy, then World of Warcraft with add-ons.
This allows for some pretty fun player interface options and looks, letting you clutter your screen with as much information or as little as you want. And we can't forget about the accessibility of players who simply can't use a mouse and keyboard. Accessibility can be found in 14 in the form of universal language on markers and effects. I'm sure that as you've watched this video, you've noticed in the Final Fantasy XIV segments the same markers on the ground over and over and over again, to the point where players can have some idea of what's coming their way based on the effect. They understand what's about to happen and what's required.
That comes from designing a game where you haven't allowed a DBM to be in.
Another major gameplay difference, which is probably what we should have started with, is the ability for one character to play every job or class in the game and switch between them. If you choose Black Mage to start, for example, like I did, and you end up hating it, like I did.
I've been told it's not solar lunar, it's astral umbral, but that's what I had in my head, is the little sunfire and moonfire.
Then you can switch to another job and try something new. Fall in love with something new, like a Red Mage, or a Warrior, or a Dragoon, like I did. And 14 is designed with this one character leveling multiple things in mind. WoW, on the other hand, is designed around having to create multiple alts to try different classes. But unlike 14, each of these new characters has some sort of racial ability or special action, and 14 doesn't have that. It doesn't mean you can't level alts in 14, but it's unnecessary to experience all the game has to offer. Warcraft does, however, have more overall combat diversity, with the option to choose talents and spec out your character in fun, weird ways, although a lot of the time people just look up what the best is. Also, the classes in WoW seem more wild and vibrant compared to that of Final Fantasy XIV. There are no Demon Hunter or Brewmaster analog, for example. It does have a Blue Mage, but it's treated as more of a joke class with wacky overpowered abilities that isn't really allowed in current content. Also, WoW really nails raiding and PvP. It's what the game was designed for, and they do it very well. The raids in WoW are larger and more intricate, the PvP is more varied and complex, but Final Fantasy XIV does something very fun with its dungeons, raids, and trials by including synced, unsynced, and minimum item level settings. You can change the difficulty of a dungeon, for example, to be exactly how it was when you first ran it in your low-level gear, or to cheese the hell out of it at max level. The last thing of note is that when crafting or gathering, 14 is much more visual and complex than WoW. It's not just clicking a node. They're actually separate jobs, separate skills, separate stories, and separate gear that you can play without ever doing the main story. Although you'd need it to unlock some zones, there are whole events built around using these crafting and gathering jobs. Building a city, for example. And as I mentioned before, crafting actually makes viable gear, unlike WoW, whose crafters are mostly useless once people can do looking for raid.
They've had crafting be viable before because of the emphasis on the world first race. It breaks things because top-end guilds have the ability to apply so many resources to it. I hesitate to say that crafting should be able to do what battle content is really designed to reward you with. There's a circular aspect to this where we do battle content to get gear to do battle content. And so we continually move, and that's how the treadmill is powered. I think within crafting, one of the problems and one of the hiccups with the way that wheel rotates is that there isn't really a reason once you make it to the top of crafting to funnel back into crafting. It kind of just stalls out unless you set your own goals, and it kind of relies on the way it interacts with the battle classes and things like that, as opposed to something where you could go invest the amount of crafting you've done in crafting. It's something I've talked a lot about with Gil and gold making, is how would I go and say, hey, I want to invest a huge chunk of gold to reduce my auction house cut on a particular set of items, so that I can funnel into that, so that, and really I'm only doing that so I can make more money to further do that, so that I create this circle that the battle systems have become so successful at. Their relevance to in-game is not what I think makes the crafting and gathering systems so unique in 14. It's that there are reasons to do them other than that. There are reasons to do them other than raid utility. The journey that itself in getting involved in making a city and going and doing various dailies, you have reputation grinds that are tied to specifically crafting and gathering. And so they really become a full-blown side piece of content. They really become a whole other way to play. Where they're every bit as big or bigger than something like pet battling or like going and transmog farming, where it becomes this whole other way to play. for somebody who may not have any interest in interacting with raid players. They may not want to provide gear to them. They may not want to even talk to them, and they can go do that as their primary form.
You're going to get tired of hearing me say it. You probably already are, but story plays a major role in the aesthetics of 14 versus WoW as well. Both games look very good, let me be clear, but they each have their own visual style. WoW is slightly more cartoony and exaggerated. Everyone has giant muscles, even the fat dudes and the gnomes. 14 is a bit more subdued in all regards. Even the colors are more toned down. Some might call the character designs a bit anime. Meanwhile, the WoW character designs are more diverse than 14 as well. Trolls, undead, humans, pandas. In 14, it's more like human, tiny human, cat human, horny human. The biggest difference I've noticed comes down to 14's emotive characters and WoW's wider array of visually diverse zones. These emotive characters make it so 14 can easily work in numerous in-game cutscenes and match the voices. In order to do the same thing in WoW, custom-crafted scenes are made, which take time and limit the number that can be included. That's not to say that Warcraft characters can't show emotion, or Final Fantasy doesn't have visually diverse zones, but each does their thing better. WoW can get more wild with their visual design because they aren't limited by players on older consoles. The PS3 version of 14 was still available until 2017, which means the PS4 version will be limiting players for a few years still. Because
it's not always consoles that are in the back. Sometimes the lowest PC spec is actually lower than the lowest console spec.
Its limits are fewer and the devs can update and change their graphics more frequently, WoW can create a more wild, outlandish, and visually striking environment for players to explore. And because 14 was started with storytelling in mind, characters' faces are designed to show a wider array of emotions. WoW, on the other hand, added story after the fact, so the game wasn't designed to have a lot of close-up facial animations. So as they add new in-game cinematics, many of the ones we're getting now seem to have these weird, flappy jaw yapping things going on.
I wonder if that's why they've started to put an emphasis on going back and redoing the character creation, is because they're trying to beef up the strength of what they can do within the model.
And that stands out from the other higher quality cinematic stuff we're used to getting in WoW. The music of these games is also another thing worth pointing out, as it again is a perfect example of my original thesis. Like the graphic design of the games, they both have good music. But similar to WoW's visual style, Final Fantasy XIV's musical style is far more diverse and wild and fun. In Warcraft, music is mostly ambient, used to set the mood of a zone or dungeon, usually something catchy, repeating, and not all that intrusive. But many times, because of its generalized nature, there are moments where it might not fit the events that are on screen in an epic boss fight, for example. There's plenty of times I remember struggling through a raid to get to the final boss and the music was pretty much the same as when I started the raid. Meanwhile, in 14, because the music, like everything else, is connected to the story, it's more moment-to-moment than WoW. Again, it's not like WoW doesn't do story moment music, or Final Fantasy XIV doesn't have ambient zone themes, but they both do their own thing way more. Final Fantasy XIV has musical themes for sad moments and happy moments.
I believe Final Fantasy has the world record for the most soundtracks included in the most tracks included in a single game.
And silly moments and tense moments. It sometimes even tells a story. There are theme songs and leitmotifs and, more importantly, battle music.
Big tacos. It's actually jarring because if you get a mount tied to an extreme version of a fight, it's pretty typical for that to have the music from that fight. And so you can be out in this zone that had this really specifically designed music to get you through it, and it can be really jarring.
just so good. Nothing makes wiping or learning a fight more tolerable than a catchy song in the background. Truthfully,
I would say Ultimate Prog might be the one difference, because you spend so long on that fight. I've watched people do Ultimate for hours, and like, that's a long time to listen to that one track.
Final Fantasy XIV just has a larger variety of music and uses it better than WoW, which is crazy because I remember listening to the soundtrack for WoW Legion and thinking how great it was, only to find out there were some songs not even used in the game, or if they were, I don't remember or missed it. I recall multiple versions of Anduin's theme, only for him to barely be involved in the main Legion storyline, and his theme to show up like maybe once or twice. That's so crazy to know they have all this amazing talent at Blizzard making music, and they don't even use it all? And remember Elite Tauren Chieftain? Final Fantasy XIV has a band of devs called the Primals, except they don't just do meme songs, they play like all the hits from the game, lyrics and all, and let me tell you, they got some bangers.
The one on the left, I believe I believe Koji is our North American localization head. He has like 9,000 jobs, so Michael Christopher Koji Fox is it's hard to describe the number of things, but as somebody from North America, you're going to interact with him regularly for any new players. As far as like when something is live translated, it is not uncommon for him to be there.
The difference is, while ETC was phased out of live events, the Primals are the highlight that everyone looks forward to. It's as if the WoW community thought ETC was kind of lame, and Final Fantasy XIV fans are like, more Primals, please!
So one of the epic reasons to go to FanFest is you get to see them live. This last time digitally was one of the few times they've been able to broadcast that. That is because there's so much emphasis put on music in 14 that they don't actually have 100% rights to everything that's been put in game. And so my understanding is that they have to be very careful with what they allow to be shown on streams, because they might have the broadcast rights, but they have to be very careful with how they distribute those, like for people reacting to streams and things like that. Because it's not just up to them. There are other people that share those rights with Square Enix to certain tracks.
So there's one last thing to talk about, and I'm sure it won't be controversial at all. The communities. I've been in the WoW community long enough to have formed a pretty substantial theory about it. I know I'm going to get lots of crap for this one, but I think the general notion is that it's pretty toxic. Yes, your personal guild might be awesome, but generally, I think we can all agree there are high levels of toxicity in the WoW community. And I believe this stems from the nature of the game itself. WoW is based in conflict, a game where two factions are pitted against each other from the beginning, so players already have an established enemy or other to focus their ire on. It is thematically ingrained in the community culture. And not only is player versus player part of the game, but so is competition on a PvE level, with world firsts and server firsts and more at a macro level, and then tools like DPS meters at a micro level to determine who is the best in the current party. Everyone is judging everyone at all times in Warcraft. It can feel overbearing. Even WoW's more cooperative events can seem like competition between players. As players are in the game longer and learn more and think they know more, biases form, opinions, valid or otherwise, take root, and soon the forums are littered with waste. You know.
There's two key differences here. First of all, WoW does not heavily police its community. It just doesn't. And so it allows it to run loose. Even many of WoW's content creators allow their community to run relatively loose, partially due to the sheer size of them. You can't police groups that big, so streams that size, regardless of what community they may come from, the vocal minority can be there. Final Fantasy has banned players for things said on streams, things posted in Reddits, Discords. If you are griefing, it is highly bannable. A 3-day ban is easy to get if you are being toxic. If you're not being toxic, you have nothing to fear, but there are times within the community where something gets misread a certain way, and we've been confused why something gets banned over here. so quickly, and then we've seen that sort of thing been allowed before. And so there is a heavy amount of curation within the 14 community where I don't know that these feelings aren't there. It's that they're not allowed to vocalize them. And so that doesn't necessarily mean the toxicity doesn't exist. You're just forcing those people to keep it to themselves. And that's got pros and cons to it. The second thing is that I don't think it's as simple as two factions in PvP. I think that I don't disagree with his premise. I think it's probably pretty spot on. But I think it also has to do with just the enormous gap in how much one player can hurt another one. When you go into something like a Mythic Plus run, if you're not doing your well, the person who brought the key, you make their life worse. And not just somebody who made your Aurum Vale run to take 40 minutes instead of 30. Like, you're damaging them. You're hurting their ability to do their next thing. And so the ability for one player to negatively impact another is massive. And so I think that where it gets really frustrating is that a really talented player playing at the top of their game and a brand new player trying to figure it out can be so far apart inside the same content because of things like alts. So in World of Warcraft, it's not uncommon for somebody to have an alt. And so you'd think, well, if they're so good, why are they even down in that same person's spot? Why are they running into new players? Because they're gearing an alt. And so you know, the Savage players within 14 that expect Savage level performance aren't necessarily running normal Eden every week. They're not necessarily spending a lot of time running dungeons because they don't need those. And so it doesn't mean they're not, but in WoW it is not uncommon to feel like I need to go grind all of this stuff. I need to go get all my character through, you know, at least some keys. I need to go. And so it is not uncommon to be put into contact where the discrepancy in what two players' expectations are and their ability to deliver on those expectations are drastically different. And so that frustration is in the friction right there. I don't think it's in the Alliance versus Horde, because Horde players only play with Horde, Alliance only plays with Alliance. And while I'm playing Horde, especially now that you can turn War Mode off, I spend the vast majority of my time not even thinking about Alliance. I think the toxic there exists. And the reason I think 14 still has it is because when it bubbles up, it's so pent up, it's so held back, that it oftentimes goes way further than anything I see in the WoW community. We have had content creators leave this community after death threats, or come in and try to post an opinion on this game that maybe the community didn't align with and get death threats. We have had people taken things way too far, and it comes from not having the ability to vent those kind of microaggressions, to be able to vent that frustration when somebody makes your day a little worse and you can't say anything, when somebody is just refusing to do basic level mechanics and you don't want to point it out because you don't want to risk that that person reports it and then you get a GM that's on the sensitive end of things and you end up somehow being penalized for just asking a person to be reasonable. And so in WoW, you would just call that person trash and move on with your day. And in 14, you keep that pent up. And so when people get really defensive of something they care for, story, for example, they can take that response really, really, really far. It's a very vocal minority, but it's the exact same as people that try to quote Asmongold's community based on the 1% of people chatting. That vocal minority defines people's perception. And when you only have so much time in a game, perception comes dangerously close to defining reality.
Toxic. 14, at least in my experience, has been different. And it's hard to explain because, sure, there must be toxicity in the community. I've heard of it. I've never seen it. And maybe that's streamer privilege. Maybe it's just I'm very lucky. I don't know. But most people, if you ask, will tell you how nice and wonderful and kind the 14 community is. But it's also jarring. If you're a WoW player coming to the Final Fantasy 14 community, there's a lot to understand that's different. Let me give you a great example. Rare mobs. Or in the case of 14, ranked mobs. In WoW, if you see a rare monster, you find a way to kill that thing as fast as you can, you grab friends, you grab guildies, you want that special drop. In Final Fantasy 14, that's frowned upon by most of the community. I found this out one day when I saw a rare, and asked my free company, my guild, for help. And they were like, dude, wait for the hunt train. And I was like, what? What the hell are you talking about? It's right here, right now. And they explained that's not how the community does it. When all the rares are finally spawned, hunt trains form, and like 100 players move from zone to zone, killing them, each getting credit for the kills and any sort of rewards. This idea baffled me. I was like, I am here right now. What if I'm...
It shouldn't baffle him as a 15-year WoW player because it did exist. Back when we couldn't solo things, Classic brought a lot of it back. And so for a lot of people, that was the first time they were in this thing where like a random person would whisper you, hey, would you like to party up? And then you party up and then you thank that person. And because you're leveling at the same pace, you run into them again a zone later and these friendships form. It has existed in WoW, but as we've gotten to as we've gotten into forced respawns, the ability to solo everything or close to it, it becomes a lot more of, I have 10 things that have to get done off my chore list today, and I don't want to wait. And so it's not uncommon for me to hop onto WoW when I have been at a time where I've wanted to do my dailies and say, hey, do you want to do your dailies? And somebody goes, oh, I already did my daily quests. I'm actually working on my Mythic Plus now. And so then I have a choice. Do I jump ahead and do my Mythic Plus with them? Because they're not going to do their dailies again. And so the content has been there. It's changes within WoW that have taken it away from that.
I'm not online later. I have to pass up the kill just cause? And they were like, yeah. And I know it sounds crazy, but having done multiple hunt trains now, I understand it completely, and I actually prefer it. It's almost like if WoW had this same concept, I may have actually seen a time lost Proto Drake once or twice. Warcraft eventually had moments like this for Nashtadar and Mechagon, but it's not on the same level. This camaraderie in the 14 community translates to how they treat new players for the most part as well. Sprouts, as they are lovingly called, are new players with a little icon next to their name. Normally, one would assume an icon next to your name letting everyone know that you have no idea what you're doing would seem like you just got yourself a scarlet letter and became a pariah. But in Final Fantasy XIV, it's the exact opposite. Instead of trolling or treating them poorly, most players cheer them on or offer advice and tips in dungeons. It makes it easier to understand if someone has no clue what's going on.
This is why I struggle so much with the 14 community saying that certain people are not welcome. Because if they had not known where that person came from, they would have logged into the game as a Sprout, and we would have taken extra care to welcome them to the game, to teach them mechanics, to be forgiving if they're making mistakes, to pull slower if they're tanking or healing and are uncomfortable. We would have taken this extra care, and yet for some reason when people say where they're coming from, specifically WoW, there are portions of the 14 community that seem to forget how we treat Sprouts, that seem to forget that any new player is a good thing, that seem to forget that what is the lifeblood of this game is growth. The lifeblood of this game is welcoming in more, that we get more content as the game gets more support, that we have more people to do things with as there's more people logged in, that wait times go down, that there's more people to share these experiences with, there's more people to go interact with in streams and on YouTube videos and in Reddit threads and Discords, that more is better. Because if you get along with a percentage of the population, the bigger that population, the better it is. And so we're so good about welcoming in Sprouts of all kinds, and we're so excited about data center visit and world visit, and yet like the moment we get out of game on social media, sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we say more new players is better except for this group of people.
You can instantly see they're new, and it's okay. And the game even rewards players with bonuses for having them in your group. And that's what I think is so special about the community in 14. I've seen plenty of players try new classes or a build or whatever in both WoW and 14. And people can get intimidated about being yelled at for sucking or not knowing something. But in 14, that little Sprout icon lets players know immediately that you're newer to the game. So they have an expectation that you might not know some things. And it makes it easier to ask, which is honestly the biggest problem in WoW. New players are always afraid to ask what to do. Just as an example of how this mentality rubs off on you, I was doing my 14 roulettes or dungeon dailies and got the final Omega raid. When it popped, I was in a group of almost all Sprouts. For those of you who don't know, this fight is what you would call a complicated dance. We wiped. A lot. And in my guild chat, I was cursing up a storm. I was so upset that I had to go through this thing that I thought was going to take me 5 minutes, but I'm here at like minute 30. But in party chat with the Sprouts, I was like, we can do this. Come on, I'll teach you how to do this fight. I've often thought about what Sprouts in WoW would be like, and the only thing I can think of is that it would mostly be people dropping from parties that they showed up in. Again, this isn't to say the Final Fantasy XIV community is perfect.
Right. The Praetorium and Castrum is an example of where the devs have had to step in and manually change the way the community was handling it. So there are times.
Obviously, assholes play all sorts of games, but the general nature of the player base seems a bit more relaxed. Yes, someone will tell me I'm doing something wrong while I stream, but that's every game, for everyone. The biggest difference, I think, is the Final Fantasy XIV community does not tolerate a lot of the stuff that WoW does. The crackdown on bad actors is swift and immediate. And some of you may be like, well, that doesn't sound cool. I guess for the people who don't want to deal with that stuff, it's pretty cool. I don't know. The last big takeaway I have on community is this. The WoW player base seems always ready to attack their game, even while loving it. And the Final Fantasy XIV community is always trying to defend their game, even if it doesn't need it. So, you've made it some 30 minutes into a YouTube video, and you find yourself here. This was all just sort of a long-winded way of saying again what I'm sure I made clear in the first 5 minutes, but I really wanted to expand upon the differences between WoW and 14, and how there are players who like each of these. So I guess that's pretty much it for this video. Sure, there's definitely going to be something I missed or couldn't find a way to fit in the video. That's what comments are for, I suppose. So please, if you have something to add or additional thoughts or insights, or if you think I'm way off, let me know. This video was done out of love for both games and the knowledge that each has its own audience, and it's okay to like one and not the other. I hope the takeaway is that if you enjoy story games as much as I do, you'll check out 14, and if you could care less, you're probably already invested in WoW, and I don't see why you should leave. That's what it comes down to, at least for me. Anyway, thanks so much.
I think play where you have friends. Play where you have fun. There are many people that play both. And I think that when we start to talk about differences in community at the end, I think a lot of it's the game. And the reason I think that is because they do have so much overlap. There are people that play one portion of an expansion, and that's their favorite part. And so they jump every other year because the expansions alternate. There are people that play whichever game is where their friends are at the time and things like that. So there are people that are in both communities heavily. And so I think that where the friction comes in is gameplay. The friction is the way these games are. He talked about that Omega where he was having trouble pushing through. But the difference is that's not a Mythic Plus key where you're damaging somebody's key. That's not a LFR run where somebody's got to then queue for multiple more other LFR runs to get their gear for the week so that they can go hop into raid night, and they've got to get their dailies done before then. You're not hurting them as directly. It can be frustrating when your roulette run's long if you have somewhere to be. If you set a time and said, hey, I got to hop off in an hour, I think I have time for this, and then you don't. By the time the queue pops and then you hop in, it runs long. That can be very frustrating. There are people that leave groups. It happens all the time. But a lot of it is the way that the game lines players up with similar goals, and that the game actively punishes people who step out of line. World of Warcraft lets people run loose and then lets people just be partied with anybody. And I think because of that, they think dungeon score is a good idea, because dungeon score is going to allow people to be separated more by this Raider IO type mentality. That's still not going to fix the fact that you have an undergeared alt that you don't know how to play as well, and you're hoping to have the same success you had on your main. It's still not going to change the very way that the game works. If anything, it's just further driving that toxicity in. I think they've missed the point. They're looking at the end thing and they're going, oh, so the problem is the players they're with. No, the problem is that I can be with people that. The problem is in the content itself. I should be allowed to play with anybody. Segregating the community is not the answer. Designing the content so that it is more clear what the objectives are when I'm in it, regardless of who I'm with, is the difference. The fact that in 14, no matter who I'm playing with, I'm in a roulette because I need roulette bonuses specifically. I'm not there to run Savage. They're just different. Yes, gear is required. Yes, the ratings can be tracked, but it's just, you have people that buy clears, and that breaks Raider IO and Dungeon Score. You have people that played really well last week, and this week they're kind of tired, and that breaks that. I think if somebody knows that E12S is a really hard fight and they're not feeling up to it, they just won't do it that night. But on WoW, there's such a long chore list, I have to get to all of it. So it's not about what I want to do. It's about what I have to do, because I can't afford to fall a week behind my guildmates. And that leads to a lot of that frustration, and that frustration ekes out into the community at large. These games are drastically different, and when you look at his time in 14, 1 year of 14 versus 15 years of WoW, it can feel like, well, are we only comparing the last year of WoW to the last year of 14? Are we comparing his 14 experience against all other 14 experiences, such as going all the way back to A Realm Reborn or even 1.0? And are we comparing that to WoW? These comparisons are really hard, because in today's market, I'm recording this the day before 9.1 goes live on World of Warcraft, there is a content drought like no other in World of Warcraft. There is a bunch of systems that people are encouraged to engage with, and that's all the content they've had. So they've engaged with this well past the point of any joy. Final Fantasy, on the other hand, is wrapping up what is one of the most critically acclaimed expansions of all time, and is going into a finale of story with the next expansion. They are going from one strong note to what is almost guaranteed to be another strong note. While WoW is questioning, do we get a second patch this expansion? Is there a third? Probably not a third, right? And so it's just different when we compare both games. When we talk about the history of WoW, it's had a lot of positive, wonderful impact on the industry and on the players who have spent time in it. Final Fantasy has as well. It's just that Final Fantasy is having a whole lot more of those in a row right now versus World of Warcraft. And so it's really, really hard, especially in a time where many of us just spent a year at home playing games, to compare a game that's in its weakest point to a game that's in its strongest and see anything but that. I think that when we make these comparisons, I just want to be fair to WoW, because WoW has had bad moments before, and so I want to believe that they can turn this around. But when people say, hey, but for now I'm not going to play, I totally get that. Go play something else. Go play Final Fantasy XIV. There's no reason to sit there and grind dailies that you don't want to do for a patch that you don't know if it will come, so that you're paying a monthly subscription to only be gaming, kinda.